What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. So one of the most requested things after the Infinity Gauntlet here on my YouTube channel was the Age of Ultron. And this makes sense because next year, Avengers 2 Age of Ultron comes out. Now the one thing you guys also need to keep in mind is that Avengers 2 Age of Ultron is only using the name. It's not going to be based around the story of Age of Ultron for a few reasons. One, because the Age of Ultron story largely revolves around the actions of Susan Storm and Wolverine, neither of which Marvel has the rights to within the realm of making movies. Now, one thing I'd like you guys to pay attention to as we're going through this story is that the Age of Ultron, in a lot of ways, is very reminiscent to the Days of Future Past. And the reason for this is because if you recall our discussion about Days of Future Past, we had talked about how it was a landmark story when it first came out, and it was a huge deal. One of the reasons why it was such a big deal was because it gave to us this idea of a very dark and dystopian future, a very bleak outlook, which is something we hadn't really seen before. With the Crooked World in Marvel UK, we had kind of delved into alternate realities, but we hadn't really seen anything on the scale of what we saw with the Days of Future Past. And so we had talked about how that story would influence other stories for generations to come. And the Age of Ultron is a perfect example of that. Now, as we get into the Age of Ultron story, we're actually following Hawkeye. And initially, we don't realize it's him. All we know is that in the torn down derelict city of New York, that somebody is following what appears to be a woman of the night as she's moving towards an apartment building of some kind. And what we see going on here is that it appears a few individuals have noticed her, and they ask her what it is that she's doing here. And Hawkeye takes this time, this moment in which they're distracted, to attack them, to kill both of the guards using his precision aim and his arrows. Now, this is a very big moment for Hawkeye, not necessarily because he's killing these guards, but because we start the story off with Hawkeye. Hawkeye in Marvel Comics had largely been relegated to a background character. One of the more notable stories involving him was the House of M and Avengers Disassembled, but again, this is one of the first times that we actually see Hawkeye being broken out as a main stage character within a Marvel storyline. And what we see is that after these individuals, these two guards are killed, that Hawkeye breaks into the building and systematically begins killing everybody in it. And again, this is interesting here because despite the fact that Hawkeye never really had top billing in Marvel Comics, he had always presented himself as a person that wasn't without mercy. But it seems as though that in this story he is cold and calculating and isn't giving anybody a chance to escape. What we also see are a couple interesting villains here. The villain in the green jacket is Owl, and the one in the gray shirt is Hammerhead. Now, Owl is a very interesting villain here because he's largely a daredevil villain, and so for us to see him in this story indicates that whatever it is that's taking place is not confined to any one superhero, is not confined to any one supervillain. Instead, it's a massive crossover event, and so as we continue, we see that Hawkeye is continuing to go through and to kill virtually anybody who opposes him. At this point, we learn that the whole reason why Hawkeye was here, the whole reason why he came to this building, is because Spider-Man is being held captive here, and his goal is to attempt to free Spider-Man, which of course he's able to successfully do. But it seems as though Peter Parker has been held drugged up. He has been more or less held unconscious, and so he's not fully aware of what's going on here, or fully, I guess, in control of his physical capabilities. And so as Hawkeye and Spider-Man are attempting to flee the building, there's some sort of massive shake, some kind of maybe massive explosion outside. We're not really sure what it is, but the entire building is shaking all around them. And what we learn here is that several Ultron robots have descended from the massive machine hovering above New York down into the apartment below. And again, this is very reminiscent of the Days of Future Past, in the sense that we saw Sentinels which were procreating themselves, more or less maintaining this element of control of society around them. And the Ultron robots tell everybody within the apartment building that they have to leave immediately, that they need to exit. But what we'll see as this story progresses is that this isn't necessarily what the Ultron robots intend. They're not really telling these people to exit. It's simply maybe a virtue of their programming. And what we learn is that while a countdown is given, the Ultron robots almost immediately destroy the entire apartment building, but not before Hawkeye and Spider-Man are able to escape. Now, Hawkeye and Spider-Man initially, on behalf of Hawkeye, does what he can to destroy these Ultron robots, and he manages to take out a couple of them, but then we learn why it is that Spider-Man was being held here. Now, this will become very important when we get into the second issue of Age of Ultron, but what Owl tells us is that there was some kind of an agreement worked out between himself and these Ultron robots, and the agreement was that as long as the Owl and his forces kept delivering superheroes or superpowered beings to Ultron and his forces, the forces would leave him alone. But these Ultron robots largely seem to ignore this, and they continue their destruction of the apartment building. Now from here, we follow Hawkeye and Spider-Man as they attempt to go underground below Central Park through the sewer system. But almost immediately after they arrive in the underground in the sewer system, they're ambushed by Luke Cage and She-Hulk. And Luke Cage tells Clint Barton that he was told not to return, that when he said he was going to leave, that he needed to stay gone. But Hawkeye says that his entire motivation here was to rescue Spider-Man, to bring Spider-Man back. Now, at the moment, we don't know why it was he had went on a mission to retrieve Spider-Man, if perhaps there was some greater motivation behind it, or if it was simply something as basic as just trying to reclaim a superhero that had been captured. But we see that for the most part, he feels justified in his actions, that he doesn't regret leaving the safety or the relative safety of this underground bunker to travel and try to gain Spider-Man. But then we see that Tony Stark arrives, and She-Hulk tells Tony Stark to do whatever it is that he needs to do. And we see that Tony Stark has some kind of device with him. Now initially, Tony Stark doesn't want to use any kind of technology out in the open, and most likely this is due to the fact that Ultron is able to detect the use of technology somewhere in the city. We're not entirely sure, but that would seem to be the most likely reason. But we see that whatever this device is that Tony Stark uses is apparently able to detect whether or not individuals who have arrived here have some kind of bug planted in them by Ultron, or if they're even an Ultron robot itself. But the device is able to verify that both Hawkeye and Spider-Man are in fact human, and they don't have any kind of tracking devices implanted in them. At this point, we transition to what appears to be a makeshift barracks, and within this makeshift barracks there are various superheroes who are holding up, and it seems as though maybe they're organizing, maybe they're trying to form a plan. But as the conversation progresses between Hawkeye and Iron Man, we learn that there is no plan, that there really is no idea here in terms of what the next step should be, and that the reason why is because the one person they're counting on to help them make a plan, the one person they're counting on to help them figure out what they should do next, is huddled in a corner crying, with Captain America's shield completely shattered. So as we continue with issue number 2 of Age of Ultron, I think you guys are actually going to find this story extremely interesting and well worth our discussion, because what this is going to do is give us more of an idea of what all's going on here. And this is where I say this story was able to capitalize on the Days of Future Past, because again, the Days of Future Past gave us a very, very small glimpse into what life was like in New York, gave us a very small glimpse into what the future was like. But where Days of Future Past gave us this tiny window, Age of Ultron gives us this massive experience, this massive picture of just how bad off the world is. And what we see as we start with issue number 2 is that we're actually in San Francisco rather than New York, and we're picking up with some woman as she's navigating her way through what appears to be a completely ravaged San Francisco. And again, we see various bodies strewn everywhere, and this really just kind of goes to indicate to us that this city has been absolutely destroyed. But what we also see is that there are Ultron robots that are simply just traversing through the city. And again, based on what we saw with the events in New York, the Ultron robots seem to be just traveling from one place to another, attempting to kill any sort of human life form that they find. And again, this is tied into our discussion on Ultron. And if you haven't seen it, of course, I would suggest that you guys go back and watch it. But with our discussion on Ultron, we had talked about how almost immediately after Ultron was created, that he developed an insane hatred for not only Hank Hank Pym, but for humanity as well. And so it seems as though all these Ultron robots exist to do is to traverse whatever location Ultron has taken over and to destroy any and all organic life forms. And with the actions of this woman, this is very interesting here. What we see is that she seems to have found a location to hide at, maybe hiding among the dead, which tells us that perhaps these Ultron robots can't differentiate between the humans who have been killed and the humans who are alive, or perhaps she's buried herself so far under that they're unable to penetrate the dead humans in order to actually see that she's alive. But again, once the Ultron robots have passed, she re-emerges from these corpses, but almost immediately after she does, some individual pulls a gun on her. And so what this man says is that she's searching for something. He believes that she may have something, that she's got a car, that she's got food, but whatever it is that she has, he demands it. And she turns around and asks him where it is that he got this gun. And what we see taking place here is that more or less this man, while he initially starts off confident with a gun pointed at her, that the longer this conversation goes on, the more shaken he becomes, indicating to us that this man's not nearly as confident as he appears. And this seems to be something that this woman is able to pick up on. She points out that this man's a coward, and she reveals herself. And what we see is that this woman is actually Black Widow, Natasha Romanoff, and that her face is disfigured. Now, most likely it's disfigured due to the result of maybe some kind of conflict with the Ultron robots, or the fact that maybe there was a firefight. We don't really know. But all we do know here is that her physical appearance has changed, and this man is a little surprised by this. He's a little caught off guard by the fact that that her face is disfigured. And so again, as this man is trying to get her to hand over whatever it is that she has, this guy is in turn shot in the head. And initially, Natasha Romanoff doesn't really know what to do. She's kind of surprised by this, but then we see that she uses sign language to communicate with somebody up on a roof. Now, we don't know exactly who this man is at first, but what we learn is that this is Mark Spector, this is Moon Knight. And so what we learn is that for the most part, it seems as though Moon Knight and Natasha Romanoff have formed this kind of alliance, where the two of them are trying to work together to figure out what it is that's going on, or at the very least, to simply just stay alive. And at this point, Natasha Romanoff does really the only thing she can, which is to loot the corpse of this man, to take what he has, and to move forward. Natasha Romanoff and Mark Spector agree to meet at a safe house. And again, we're not exactly sure what this safe house is, but I would go as far as to suspect that it's one of Nick Fury's safe houses. But as Natasha Romanoff is making her way, we see that one of the Ultron robots is in an alleyway and appears to be telling some individuals to either submit or to perish. And these individuals run for it. They immediately try to bail out, but as soon as they do, they're all totally incinerated. They're immediately killed off. Now, Natasha Romanoff is able to stay hidden. She's able to stay away from this and allow this event to take place. And while it does seem, I guess, a little cold and calculating, it really is the only way for her to stay alive. And again, this points to just how dire the situation is, that almost immediately after any human is spotted, they're killed off by these Ultron robots. From here, we pick up with Natasha Romanoff as she enters some kind of a barber shop. And again, this is very, I guess, reminiscent of the early days in Captain America comics, when he and the Falcon had transitioned to the basement of a barber shop when we had our discussion during the Infinity Gauntlet about Quasar, about Wendell Vaughn. And again, it seems as though they're descending down into a safe house, into some place that's very well hidden. And Mark Spector is meeting her there. And Mark Spector tells her, for the most part, that this situation that they're in, this place that they're in, is more or less the safest place for them to be at. There's really the safest location they can get, that every day things are getting worse and worse, that more and more people are dying. And so we see that this sort of wall has been created, where we see various superheroes who have been pinned here. Now, we don't know exactly whether or not all these individuals are dead, or if all these individuals are alive, or if maybe some of them are dead and some of them are alive. We're not 100% sure. There are some people here that we would think wouldn't be affected by this. For example, the Silver Surfer. We would think that this is largely an Earthbound event, and the Silver Surfer is largely in a beyond the Earth kind of character, where he simply only gets involved on the planet Earth if there's some major sort of crisis going on here. But we also see people like the Wasp, Luke Cage, who we know is alive, the Sentry, Robert Reynolds, Black Bolt. And so for the most part, we're led to believe that maybe these individuals are alive. But again, this is just kind of up for debate here. What we also learn is that this is indeed Nick Fury's, or one of Nick Fury's secret hideouts, and that while Nick Fury has a large majority of them all around in different locations, that again, this is probably one that most people don't know about. And the reason why Natasha Romanoff tells us this is the case is because Nick Fury never kept never kept them written down. He never actually left a paper trail for anybody to follow. And so because of that, no one knows about this safe house except for those individuals that Nick Fury may have told, or those individuals who for whatever reason had simply just stumbled upon it. Now, whether or not it's possible that Ultron could find this place by interrogating other people who may have known where it is something we don't know. But I would go as far as to say that I doubt the Ultron robots would go as far as to interrogate somebody and then track down 2 humans, when it's inevitable that they would most likely die out of starvation or dehydration eventually due to a lack of resources as time goes on. But from here, we transition back to Central Park, back to Peter Parker. And what we get with Peter Parker is actually a really cool story here. Peter Parker more or less gives us this idea of what's going on from his perspective, in the sense that we learn how everything began to unfold here. And what Peter Parker tells us is that this all started while he was asleep, that he was simply just in his apartment, presumably the night after or I guess the day after he had spent all night long parading around as Spider-Man and fighting various criminals here and there. But what wakes him up is this kind of explosion, this massive shift. And when he looks out the window, he realizes that some giant machine is tearing through New York. And as things progress, as panic begins to reign, that he's trying to figure out what it is that's going on. Now, for the most part, this is about as in-depth as our story with Peter Parker goes in this comic, but what Peter Parker also tells us is that this seems to be everywhere, that there is no safe place, there is no military, there's no Washington, D.C., that everything is gone here. The other question that he answers is the question that everybody's asking of how it was that he was kidnapped and why he was kidnapped. And Peter Parker says he doesn't know. He says that for the most part, all he knows is that as he was trying to figure out what was going on, as he was trying to save various people, that his spider sense didn't even go off, that some kind of a flashbang initiated, and he woke up tied up to a chair. But what he also tells us is that he had heard some of the guards talking, some of the people holding on to him, or what it was that they were saying, and they were saying things like they had struck a deal with Ultron, that they were going to take people into Ultron, and Ultron would in turn leave them alone. Now, of course, the question that everybody asks is, why would Ultron do this? Why would Ultron care about what it is that's going on with various people? Or even if he did have a desire to eradicate humanity, why is it that he would work with people? Why wouldn't he simply just eradicate them on sight? And Spider-Man says that he doesn't know. He has no real idea what it is that's taking place here. He has no real idea why it is that Ultron would get involved with humans if what he wanted to do was kill humans in the first place. And so from here, we see this kind of speculation taking place where various people are trying to figure out what's going on, where various people are trying to discuss what it is that might take place. But what we also see Spider-Man saying, or I guess asking, is what it is that they're going to do, what the next step is, what kind of plan it is that everybody has. But what Tony Stark says is that their only real plan is to survive. And Peter Parker says that surviving isn't doing anything, that they have to do something. And Captain America agrees. Captain America jumps up and says that the reason why nothing had been done was because they didn't have a plan, or at least not until now. So as we pick up with Age of Ultron issue number 3, we start off with She-Hulk and Luke Cage, and it seems as though whatever it is that's going on here may be part of the plan that was presumably created by Captain America. And again, what we see is that Luke Cage asks She-Hulk if she sees anything, presumably whether or not she sees any Ultron robots. And She-Hulk says no, says that she doesn't actually see anybody. And so what Luke Cage tells her is to simply just brace herself, to go limp. And it seems as though the reason why is because he's going to punch her as hard as he possibly can, but if she braces herself for the impact, she's not going to be knocked out. So as long as she goes limp and he can hit her as hard as he can, then she'll most likely fall unconscious. And so what we see is that when this happens, when Luke Cage punches her as hard as he possibly can, that the result is that the immediate area begins to shake due to the impact. Now, half of this is due to the indestructible skin that Luke Cage has and the incredible strength that he has along with it, and the other half is simply just due due to the sheer force of impact against a being as strong as She-Hulk. And so we see that She-Hulk falls unconscious, and Luke Cage picks her up to presumably carry her back to where Ultron is. At this point, we jump back through a flashback from Luke Cage to about an hour before we started this story. And what Spider-Man is saying here is that everybody more or less just kind of needs to suck it up, that everybody just sort of needs to get it together, and they need to go back on the offensive and try to fight Ultron. Emma Frost replies by saying that it's just not that easy, that there are so few of them left that they would probably be wiped out almost immediately, that individuals like Scott Summers are gone. And we see, of course, that it's chimed in that Thor is gone, that the Incredible Hulk Bruce Banner is gone, and that Ben Grimm is gone. And so for the most part, the most physically powerful individuals they have, the foundation of powerhouses that they have within the superhero universe are gone, that there's really no way for anybody to physically go toe-to-toe with any of the Ultron robots. And so all they really have left on their side is their intellect, is their ability to be cunning. The Spider-Man asked Luke Cage about Jessica Jones and their newborn baby, and Luke Cage doesn't reply, but we see that Luke Cage is kind of crying to himself as he's more or less retelling us this story, indicating that Jessica Jones and his newborn baby were both killed in the initial attack by Ultron. From here, we see Captain America saying that things are the way they are now because they didn't have a plan before. They didn't have a plan before the arrival of Peter Parker, and that the idea here is to give them something to trade, is to give Ultron something to barter with. Now, what we'll learn is that initially it's not the idea to simply just barter, that Captain America has a second point to this plan. And Hawkeye asks him what it is that they should barter for, and Spider-Man continues, again with a little prodding from Captain America, to retell what it was that he had told them previously, that the Owl, as Spider-Man had overheard it, was able to maintain its operations. They were able to continue doing whatever it was that they were doing before, as long as they made payments to Ultron, and the payments were in the form of superheroes. And so most likely, a large majority of the superheroes, or even supervillains who had been killed, were probably killed by the Owl and various other people who were selling them off in order to keep themselves alive. And again, Emma Frost continues by saying that, Storm continues by saying that nobody's answering her question. Now the question here is, why wouldn't Ultron simply just kill everyone? Why wouldn't Ultron simply just wipe everybody out? Why would he go through all the trouble to simply ruin the world? And Tony Stark chimes in by saying that he knows exactly why Ultron hasn't simply just killed everyone. And what Tony Stark gives us is some really interesting insight into Ultron, and is probably the answer to the question that a lot of you guys are asking of, why is it that Ultron hasn't killed everyone? What Tony Stark tells us is that Ultron was created to have human needs and desires, and that he thinks that what Ultron is doing right now is replicating what he thinks needs and desires are. So the idea of revenge, of torture, so on and so forth, that these are all ideas that Ultron has programmed himself to believe. And so he's acting out effectively the way that he thinks a human would act out. And so he asked the question, let's say that Ultron won and that he took over the world, then what would happen? And Emma Frost replies by saying that it simply just wouldn't be enough. And so the idea here is that Ultron is more or less establishing himself as a dictator and living out the role of a dictator, but that they're not really sure exactly what the end result of all this is going to be. And so from here, we see that that Hawkeye replies by saying that this is all Hank Pym's fault. And again, Tony Stark sides on with Hank Pym here. He says that it's not necessarily Hank Pym's fault. And Hawkeye gets angry here. Hawkeye says that who else's fault would it be? That it's not the fault of anybody else aside from Hank Pym, because Hank Pym was the one who created Ultron. Now again, if you recall our discussion about Ultron, we had talked about how when he was first created by Hank Pym, that almost immediately Ultron rebelled, but then Ultron had modified the memories of Hank Pym so that Hank Pym would never remember the fact that he made Ultron. And so by the time Ultron had re-emerged with Ultron number 5, that he was far more advanced than he had previously been, and was an almost unstoppable force, that he could simply just be held off, but that he could never really be killed because he would simply just reconstitute himself in one form or another. And so again, more or less what's taking place here is this, intervention, or this intervening of Captain America in saying that none of what's going on matters anymore, that none of this arguing and this debating matters, that what matters is that it's time to make a plan, that if Ultron is buying and selling people, if he is taking trades, if he is allowing people to continue their operations as long as they give Ultron superheroes or superpowered beings, then he says, why not just give him one of them? Why not have one of them be handed in, more or less? And Wolverine chimes in and says that that can't really get them that far into Ultron's world. But again, we see, I guess, this idea more or less coming to fruition, where the idea is maybe one of them can get further inside than they normally would, that maybe one of them would be able to get deep inside the base of Ultron and be able to actually influence or be able to initiate some incredible damage here, be able to initiate some, I guess, a set of circumstances, more or less, whereby Ultron could effectively be destroyed. And so we see that again, Hawkeye chimes in and says that he doesn't really know how successful this would be. He doesn't know how powerful an individual would have to be in order to actually get in there and to inflict some damage. And so what we see Wolverine saying is that it would have to be somebody incredibly powerful here. It would have to be somebody very, very strong, somebody durable, somebody sturdy, somebody who is not indestructible. And so we immediately see that She-Hulk and Luke Cage volunteer themselves in order to go in and to try to infiltrate Ultron's base. And initially the idea is no, that She-Hulk should be the one to do it. But again, Luke Cage says that he has indestructible skin. He has the ability, more or less, to not be killed. But again, She-Hulk says that she's the stronger of the two. Now, what's very interesting about this entire set of circumstances here, and something that I hope you picked up, is that Maria Hill is part of the team here. Maria Hill is part of these forces. She's part of this superhero group, or this group of individuals who are trying to stay alive. And what this more or less tells us is that the idea of enemies, the idea of allies, isn't really something that exists here. It's people who are simply just trying to live. And so again, we see that Emma Frost uses her ability to read the mind of others and to tell everybody that Tony Stark is going to say that it's not going to work, that this is not going to be successful, that neither of them are going. And Tony Stark says yes. He says that this is only half a plan, that it's not a full plan, and that it's not worth the life of another person. But then we see She-Hulk overruling him by simply saying that she's not going to just sit around, that the idea of waiting to die is worse than simply going out and doing something that may result in them dying. And so she wants to do something. She wants to get involved somehow, that she wants to be the one that breaks into Ultron's fortress. And so Luke Cage says okay, and says that he'll be the one that'll take her. But Wolverine says no. Wolverine says that he should be the one to take She-Hulk. But then we see Captain America saying that this would be a ridiculous thing to do, because Wolverine has adamantium lace skin, and that, or adamantium lace bones rather, and that Ultron would immediately take Wolverine. He wouldn't even allow Wolverine to be to hand She-Hulk over, that he would take Wolverine and he would dissect Wolverine and use his adamantium, possibly even try to find a way to replicate it and use it for his own means. And so somebody else needs to go along, somebody that can hand She-Hulk over and then walk away. And so the idea here is that they're going to stick with Luke Cage, that Luke Cage is going to be the one to hand She-Hulk over to Ultron. From here, we see them trying to decide where to go next, that because they're going to be leaving this base, that they can't come back here. And so Captain America says they should go to the Mutate Village in Savage Land, and that for the most part, while he believes that it's not necessarily been conquered by Ultron, that the possibility remains, but that's a possibility that they're going to have to take a gamble on. And so we see that, again, She-Hulk and Luke Cage set out to complete this plan that's been laid out by Captain America. At this point, we pick up with Luke Cage as he's carrying She-Hulk back to Ultron's base. And as Luke Cage approaches the base, several Ultron robots arrive, and Luke Cage says that he has a Hulk and that he wants to trade. From here, we transition to Chicago, and when we pick up with Chicago, we see that some individual is more or less detecting the fact that the air is poison here, that the air is most likely irradiated. Now, this is probably due to maybe some kind of nuclear devastation, some kind of nuclear fallout. We don't really know, but we learn that of the individuals who are here, that we're currently seeing Black Panther, Thunderbolt Ross as Red Hulk, and the Taskmaster. And again, the Taskmaster's involvement here more or less tells us that there really are no enemies here. There really are no villains here. That it's simply just people trying to survive. And so what we see Taskmaster observing is that there is an Ultron robot down on the about 1.5 miles away, alongside some individual, some kind of human. Now, whether or not this is a superpowered being is something we don't know, but we see that Thunderbolt Ross immediately takes off and goes after this Ultron robot, which appears to have been the plan. Now, why it is he's doing this is something we don't know, but we learn that during the conflict, or I guess during the fight between Thunderbolt Ross and this Ultron robot, that he tears the robot's head off. And with the robot's head comes what appears to be a kind of makeshift spinal cord. And the intention, as it's explained to us, seems to be that Black Panther and Taskmaster are going to use this head of Ultron to perhaps try to find some way to defeat the other Ultron robots, or even Ultron itself. And so for the most part, we see that while Thunderbolt Ross is overwhelmed by the arrival of other Ultron robots, the Taskmaster and Black Panther immediately run for it at the behest of Thunderbolt Ross to leave him behind. From this point, we transition back to New York with Luke Cage and She-Hulk. And Luke Cage is heading back into the major fortress, or I guess into the main base of Ultron, which apparently resides within Times Square. And once he actually gets inside of the building, we learn a very disturbing fact. What we learn here is that it's not in fact Ultron that's running the show, that it is in fact Vision. Now, we don't know exactly at this moment why it is that Vision is here, or why Vision is the one that's actually taking the place of Ultron. That'll actually be something that's explained to us in Age of Ultron issue number 4. So as we continue with Age of Ultron issue number 4, we again pick up with Luke Cage as he realizes that the Vision is actually occupying this current point within the Ultron city, that it's not actually Ultron who's here. Now at the moment, we don't know if Ultron is the one that's controlling everything through Vision, or if it's actually the Vision who has somehow gone awry and is controlling everything. But what the Vision asks Luke Cage is what it is that he has to offer. And Luke Cage asks the Vision if he's the one that did all this, if he's the one that he's talking to. And Vision says that Ultron can hear him, that Ultron can see Luke Cage. And for the most part, Luke Cage doesn't really know what to make of this. Luke Cage is a little unsure, and he again asks where it is that Ultron is at, presuming that Ultron may very well be in a different city, or perhaps out in space, or something like that. But what the Vision tells us is that Ultron isn't even in this current time, that Ultron is actually in the future, that he's controlling everything from the future. He's controlling these Ultron robots, and he is to a degree controlling the Vision. Now the Vision says this of his own accord, indicating to us that Ultron is really more, I guess, using the Vision more of like a window to control the past, more so than outright controlling the Vision. And so the Vision seems to be used simply as a conduit for Ultron to control the past. And what the Vision says once, I guess, Ultron regains control of him is asking again Luke Cage what it is that he has to offer. But She-Hulk has overheard enough at this point. She realizes that there's really only one road from this point, and so what she does is tell Luke Cage to get out of here and to tell Tony Stark everything he's overheard. From here, Luke Cage is a little surprised by this, and Luke Cage is actually reluctant to leave, and so She-Hulk throws him out of the building. From this point, She-Hulk again goes on a tangent and says that she believes that she's almost the strongest one there is, as she begins to defeat, or I guess to tear apart, these various forms of the Ultron robots. But just as she's beginning to gain the upper hand, one of the Ultron robots is able to shoot her in the side of the head with a laser beam and effectively kill her. From this point, we see the Vision is a little disheartened to realize that she's dead, and that he really is helpless to stop any of this from happening. And so as Luke Cage is is landing after his throw from the building, the Ultron robots begin to pursue him. And again, because Luke Cage has indestructible skin, there really isn't a whole lot they can do to defeat him, and so Luke Cage begins to take out his rage and aggression on them. He tells them that they killed his wife, that they killed his baby, that they killed his friends. But as Luke Cage is again preparing to try to defeat these Ultron robots, that it appears that what's taking place is a nuclear blast over New York City. Now, we don't know exactly whether or not Luke Cage survives this nuclear blast yet. All we know is that at this point, there's been a massive explosion within the immediate vicinity of downtown Manhattan. From here, we pick up with Mark Spector and Natasha Romanoff, and what Natasha Romanoff is telling us here is that she was able to open the black box that they were previously unable to open, and that within this black box are Nick Fury's end of the world scenarios, one of which is a situation in which Ultron was able to take over the world. And the question that Mark Spector is asking here is, what are they supposed to do? What's supposed to happen next? Natasha Romanoff says that Nick Fury had a series of secret bunkers all over the world, and that one of the bunkers was designed to be an end of the world bunker, and that this end of the world bunker is located located in the Savage Land, indicating to us that both the forces of Captain America as well as Natasha Romanoff and Mark Spector will most likely all end up meeting together within the Savage Land proper. At this point, we transition to 8 days later, and what we see is that the forces of Captain America's team have arrived in the Savage Land, but rather than finding a Savage Land, which may very well have been free from the destruction of Ultron's forces, they instead find that the Savage Land has been riddled with destruction. There are various potholes, and they appear to be nuclear explosions around various portions of the area. And again, they found a jet here, a Avengers jet, and the question they have is who it was that flew it here and how it landed, or who it was that did this. Again, the Invisible Woman is keeping them invisible for the most part, so they're trying to do what they can to decipher what it is that's taking place before going further, because for all they know, it could very well be another Ultron robot or some other third party they're unaware of who has somehow managed to land in the Savage Land. But as they're investigating the area, they realize that there is a man on the hilltop, and when they reach this hilltop, they realize that it's Kazar, the Lord of the Savage Land. Now, Kazar is a character that we haven't necessarily gotten into yet for a good reason. That reason being because, for the most part, he's not a wildly important character in the realm of Marvel Comics at the moment. He's more important back in the 90s, but for this point, he's really not a major player in this story. But what he tells us is that when Ultron's forces began to overrun the world, when they began to take over, that they invaded everywhere, which included the Savage Land, and that what's left, these various huts in this small little village, is all that's left of Kazar's people, of the various people spread across the Savage Land who have managed to come together to try to keep themselves safe. But he also tells them that within one of these huts is what it is that they're looking for. Emma Frost uses her telepathic abilities and realizes that within this hut is Luke Cage, and that Luke Cage had piloted the Avengers jet that they had found, and apparently had been irradiated due to the fallout from the nuclear explosion, that he's alive, but that none of them need to go in there and see him, most likely indicating that he's grotesquely disfigured as a result of his exposure to the nuclear blast. And she tells us that Luke Cage, after the explosion, had crawled to safety, had managed to make it into the jet, and then crawled to this village within the Savage Land. And what Luke Cage tells Emma Frost telepathically is that Ultron is not in this current time, that Ultron is in the future, and that in order for them to defeat Ultron, they're going to have to find a way to travel to the future. And so again, we see that this question becomes, what are they going to do next? What's going to happen next? And as the group is trying to figure this out, we see somebody else chime in and say that they're going to get Ultron. At this point, we switch to Red Hulk, and Red Hulk says they're going to eliminate Ultron from the face of existence. At this point, we learn that who also is here is Mark Spector, Moon Knight, along with Natasha Romanoff. And Natasha Romanoff tells them that because they discovered Nick Fury's, end of the world scenario files, because they discovered the location of his end of the world bunker, that they know exactly how it is that they're going to have to kill Ultron. So as we pick up with Age of Ultron issue number 5, there are a couple things we need to clarify, and the reason why is because this story is going to become relatively confusing in a very fast pace. Now, the whole basis for this Age of Ultron story is that the Ultron forces, or I guess these various Ultron robots, have successfully conquered the planet Earth. And at the beginning of this story, we didn't know how. All we had really known is that they had simply just appeared and began destroying various cities. It wasn't until the last issue, or I guess until issues number 3 and 4, that we learned that what appeared to be the case was that the Vision was maybe controlling these robots. But what the Vision had informed us was that Ultron in the future was controlling these robots. And so what had basically taken place is that Ultron had used the Vision as a conduit. And what this means is that the Vision is more or less an open window from the future into the present. And so what Ultron did is, by virtue of manipulating the Vision, he created this window. He established this window that allowed him to speak from the future into his past, which is the current timeline or the current set of circumstances in the Marvel or in this comic. But what we see as the story begins to open up here is that the superheroes are making their way to Nick Fury's bunker, and Tony begins to more or less comment on this. Tony Stark begins to, I guess, comment on their current situation and saying that this is all funny to him in a very dark and humorous kind of way. And the reason why was because when the Vision had first showed up, the Vision was an agent of Ultron, and so they didn't really know if they could trust the Vision or not. But the Vision had turned against Ultron and helped the Avengers defeat Ultron. And so because of this, the Avengers simply just welcomed the Vision in. The Scarlet Witch eventually married the Vision. They had befriended the Vision. And while they had treated the Vision like a human, the fact remained that the Vision was not. The Vision was a robot. And so they didn't understand the technology that was used by Ultron to create the Vision. They really had no understanding of the Vision. And so it could very well be that there was a subroutine implanted in the Vision somewhere along the line that would allow Ultron to alter his programming or to take control of the Vision, that would allow the Vision to become a conduit for Ultron to manipulate the past from the future. But again, Tony Stark's more or less just talking to himself here. He's more or less just providing this commentary for himself. And the reason why is because a lot of the other superheroes are more or less assuming that Tony Stark has kind of lost his mind. And so we see that Captain America is doing what he can to keep everybody's morale up, to keep everybody focused on the current objective, which is to reach Nick Fury's bunker. From here, we see that they've arrived at the bunker. They're currently at its location, but again, they're very wary here. And the reason why they're so wary is because they don't know what's on the other side. They don't know what's within the bunker. It could very well be that Ultron was aware of this bunker because he was in the future, and he had planted a multitude of Ultron robots inside, and that once the door is opened, these robots would come pouring out and annihilate all of these superheroes. And so he initially calls on Emma Frost, but Emma says that the basis, or I guess the fortitude of this compound is such that she can't access it using her telepathy. She doesn't know what's within this bunker. He then calls on Wolverine, and Wolverine says that to him it just smells like a jungle, again commenting that he doesn't know what's on the other side. But what Emma Frost says is that she doesn't like this, that if the bunker was built to keep telepaths out, then that means that it could be that on the other side of this bunker are Ultron robots. We then see that that Captain America calls on Susan Storm and asks Susan Storm if she can use her invisibility to get closer to the entrance without being detected. And when she does, she realizes two things: that one, there's some kind of a key code here. There's some kind of a keypad that has to be used to access this giant door. But the other thing is that this door doesn't necessarily seem to be something that can easily be destroyed, that none of the superheroes, as it appears, would be able to tear this door down. Now, initially, Captain America calls on Spider-Man here and asks Spider-Man if he senses any kind of a danger, but Spider-Man says that his power doesn't work that way, that his spider sense is reactionary, that he himself has to be in danger in order for him to actually, or in order for his spider sense to actually go off. And so he uses the only option left to him, which is Thunderbolt Ross, the Red Hulk. And so what the Red Hulk does is use his vast strength, his incredible strength, to punch down the door, which of course we had previously believed was something that just couldn't be done. But what we see almost immediately after he enters and the other superheroes begin to make their way in is that he is pelted by a barrage of bullets. And the bullets appear to be the kind that may not necessarily kill Thunderbolt Ross, but at the very least are possibly able to injure him. And what we learn is that the person that's shooting Thunderbolt Ross with all these bullets is in fact Nick Fury himself, telling us that Nick Fury has yet again managed to find a way to survive against all odds, because despite the fact that Nick Fury is an established S.H.I.E.L.D. agent, despite the fact that he is the director of S.H.I.E.L.D., in the end, Nick Fury is just a man, that he can be killed just like anybody else, and that the Infinity Formula, as we had previously talked about in our Nick Fury videos, only goes as far as enabling him to survive the, I guess, the aspect of dying of old age. And so what Nick Fury says here is that before any of them enter the bunker, that he's going to use some kind of scanning device to make sure that they are in fact who they claim to be, that they're not Ultron robots disguised as humans. And so once he's satisfied with this, once he realizes that all of them are in fact who they claim to be, he allows them into the bunker. And from this point, what Nick Fury tells us is that he's been here for about a week or so, that he's surprised that it took these superheroes to get here this long, but they say that they didn't even know this bunker was here. They were totally unaware aware of it, that it wasn't until Black Widow and Mark Spector had arrived that they had learned that this bunker was actually in existence. And what Nick Fury says is that he had built this bunker after the Skrull invasion, after the Secret Invasion. Now, the Secret Invasion is, again, a story we haven't gotten into yet. This was a story that had taken place after Civil War. But the Secret Invasion was a story whereby the Skrulls were invading the planet Earth and replicating various superheroes and humans. And so Nick Fury, knowing that he couldn't really trust anybody, had designed this bunker so that if things went from bad to worse, or if some extreme measure had to be taken, that he would be able to do that. And this extreme measure is actually revealed to us by Tony Stark. What we learn is that this bunker is not just a bunker, that this bunker is more or less Doctor Doom's time platform. Now again, Doctor Doom's time platform is not something that we've talked about yet because we haven't really gotten into Doctor Doom, but the time platform is exactly what it sounds like. It allows individuals to travel through time. And so again, this is where we're going to be seeing these superheroes manipulate the concept of time. What Nick Fury also says is that he believes that Ultron is in the future, which is something that we were already aware of. But what he says is that the idea here, the entire basis of this plan, was something that wasn't necessarily contingent on the superheroes, that he was going to give them a few more days, but that if they didn't show up, that he was going to go on this assignment by himself. And so we see that for the most part, various superheroes begin to chime in and begin to volunteer themselves. Of course, Mark Spector, Moon Knight volunteers along with Black Widow. But we see that Nick Fury's telling them that he's going to need more than 2 of them, that the plan is to go directly to where Ultron is at, to enter his fortress, and to effectively just annihilate him. But it's not going to be something that can be done with sheer force, that it's going to require both a lot of stealth and a lot of firepower, and that he has a lot of technology to go with it. But Tony Stark is against this. Tony Stark rationalizes that if Ultron is in the future, then this current moment is Ultron's past. And so if this is Ultron's past, then Ultron knows what's going to happen here. He knows what road they're going to take, and so he knows that they're going to attempt to arrive at his fortress and they're going to attempt to destroy him, and so he's going to be prepared for it. But Quicksilver chimes in and says that it's their only real hope, it's the only real opportunity they have. But then Wolverine chimes in, and Wolverine says this is not necessarily the case. Wolverine rationalizes here that Hank Pym was the one who created Ultron, and that they could go back in time if they wanted to, and they could kill Hank Pym before he ever created Ultron. Now initially, this idea is almost immediately turned down by everyone. Everyone says that this can't be done, that if they went back and killed Hank Pym before he made Ultron, that they would be killing him for something that he hadn't done yet. They'd be killing an innocent man. But not only that, they'd be killing a friend. And so the ramifications of this are something that they can't even begin to understand, that if Hank Pym doesn't exist, what would the future look like? What could possibly happen? Things could turn out almost exactly the way they are now, or they could turn out far darker than they currently are, or they could turn out much better than they are. The fact remains, no one knows what would happen to the entire space-time continuum if this action took place. And so this idea of Wolverine's is almost immediately shot down. This is almost not going to happen. No one is really on the side of this. And so what Nick Fury does is that he says that while everybody else is trying to figure out what they want to do, he unlocks this kind of vault, this more or less weapons cache. And when he does, we see a multitude of arms and armament belonging to various either dead or alive superheroes that may have handed their stuff over to Nick Fury. Of course, we see Magneto's helmet, we see the Mark II from Iron Man's past, which of course was a very primitive Iron Man armor and is one that's not tapped into any kind of network, and so Ultron wouldn't be able to take over this suit. We see of course various things like Hawkeye's arrows and so on and so forth, but what's explained to us here is that all these things are going to need to be used. All these things are going to have to be used for the purpose of invading Ultron's fortress. But again, we see that most of these superheroes are a little hesitant here. Most of these superheroes, while they are very interested in defeating Ultron, at the very least have these very subtle, unsure, I guess, motives or feelings. They're a little nervous about what's going to take place, but none of them are really backing out. And so once they realize where the coordinates are going to be, once they realize where it is that they're going to arrive and what it is that they're going to do, most all the superheroes on board. And so what we see is that as a time platform begins to activate, Quicksilver says that if they don't make it back, or I'm sorry, Nick Fury says that they don't make it back, that they're supposed to burn this place down. They're supposed to destroy the entire bunker. And so we see the superheroes begin to to, I guess, travel into the future by virtue of this platform. But almost immediately after most of the superheroes jump into the future, we see that Wolverine asks Peter Parker if he knows how to manipulate this time platform. And Peter Parker asks him whether or not he wants to chase after him. But what Wolverine says is that he wants to go back into the past, that he wants to go back and he wants to kill Hank Pym. Peter Parker is almost immediately against this, but Wolverine says that in a very interesting kind of situation here, that there really is no hope for the forces of Nick Fury, that the Ultron forces had killed Thor, they had killed the Thing, they'd killed Luke Cage, they'd killed some of the strongest superheroes, and so for those superheroes to attempt to go back, for Red Hulk to go back along with others, that there really wouldn't be anything they could do to stop the forces of Ultron. And so the only real option here is for them to go back into the past and for them to kill Hank Pym. So as we get into Age of Ultron issue number 6, we're going to be seeing this really cool story playing out, because what's going to happen is we're going to transition between the future and the past. But what we're going to learn are a couple things. The first is we're going to learn exactly how bleak the future is. But what we're also going to learn is what happens when you go into the past and you make changes. That just because one action takes place doesn't necessarily mean that there are not going to be massive ramifications. And in fact, we're actually going to learn that the actions of Wolverine here are going to stretch far beyond the Age of Ultron story, and is actually going to be used by Marvel to introduce characters later on down the line. It's going to be used to introduce characters from other alternate realities into the Marvel Universe, although of course that'll take place beyond the scope of the Age of Ultron event. But what we see as we start this story is of course that Wolverine has used Dr. Doom's time platform and is emerging from where the bunker would have been in its geographical location, but of course he's in the past here. And what he does is for the most part just explore the immediate area of the Savage Land, the immediate area of the cave, to ensure that everything's okay, to make sure that there's no trap going on here, that the Ultron robots aren't present, that there's no, I guess, excavation or investigation or the presence of anyone that isn't supposed to know that he's there. But as he's moving around, he realizes that he's not alone. And so what he tells this person is to show themselves. And what we learn is that the person that's followed him is Susan Storm. Now initially, Susan Storm was supposed to join Nick Fury's team in the future as they attempted to enter the base of Ultron and to defeat Ultron, but she had stayed behind. And when Wolverine asks her about this, she says that she had a change of heart when she saw that Wolverine wanted to kill Hank Pym, and that the look that he had in his eye was a look to indicate that he would not be assuaged, that he would not be moved from this mindset. And so as soon as Captain America, who had told him not to go into the past, had left with Nick Fury to go into the future, she knew that Wolverine was going to try to use the platform to travel into the past and try to kill Hank Pym. And so what she does, and what her and Wolverine get involved with, is this really cool debate, this really cool discussion that is logic versus morality. And this is one of the best parts of the Age of Ultron event, because what she's saying here is that this is a moral problem that Wolverine is encompassing, that Wolverine is representing here. Wolverine is taking the stance that in order to more or less save lives, that a person has to die. And she initially again says that she knows this is wrong, that in her heart of hearts she can't say that this is something okay to do. But then Wolverine replies by saying that if somebody put a gun to one of her children's head, would she kill them? Would she do whatever she needed to do to save their lives? And initially she's a little hesitant to answer, but Wolverine says that of course she would, that of course she would kill whoever it was that was trying to harm her children. Wolverine says that this is more or less the same thing, but that it involves countless people. And so for Wolverine, this is a logical stance. This is more or less this utilitarian stance, that in order to satisfy the needs of the many, that the few are going to have to die. And so for Wolverine, again, this is very simple. One man, Hank Pym, created Ultron. And because he created Ultron, the future has turned out the way that it has. And so he rationalizes that if he goes back and kills one man, he can save billions of people. And so initially, again, Susan Storm hasn't necessarily sided with this, but she is somewhat understanding of his opinion, somewhat understanding of his stance, even if only insofar that she recognizes she would still have her children and her family if Hank Pym wasn't alive. But before either of them can debate any further, there seems to be some kind of disturbance coming closer towards where they're located at. And what we see is that a very young version of Nick Fury has arrived here in his hover car. And of course, this seems to be around the time that Nick Fury has discovered this bunker, or discovered this location, which may be an optimal place for him to build the bunker. We don't really know why he's here yet. This is simply just a chance for Marvel to introduce a way for them to gain some sort of transportation to the city, which of course is what they do when they steal the vehicle of Nick Fury. When Nick Fury comes out, of course, he finds his vehicle gone, and Wolverine and Susan Storm make their way back to New York City. Now at this point, we transition to the future, and what we see is that Quicksilver, along with the other forces of Nick Fury, have arrived at wherever this place happens to be, which is revealed to us to be the Savage Land. But rather than finding a place that is devoid of any and all kind of life, a place that has been absolutely ravaged, like what we had seen before they had traveled into the future, we instead see a Savage Land that is much better off, a Savage Land that appears to be pristine in its nature. That of course you have various, I guess, dinosaurs flying around, you have a very clean and a very beautiful sort of environment. And they find this a little strange here. They didn't expect this. They expected that everything was going to be totally trashed, that everything was going to be totally destroyed. And so we see that as they're trying to figure things out, that Captain America realizes somebody is gone. And of course, Nick Fury realizes this as well, and Iron Man comments and says that Susan Storm was supposed to be with them. Nick Fury at this point gets very angry, and the reason why is because Susan Storm was supposed to be their stealth component. She was supposed to be the person to sneak in. But again, Iron Man comments and says that it really wouldn't have done any good to have had Susan Storm here. And the reason why is because while she can be invisible, that Ultron most likely has some kind of thermal imaging program set up, and so the cameras would have immediately detected her body heat. They wouldn't have been able to, or they would have been able to see her, and so it really wouldn't have made any sense to have her around. But again, Nick Fury says that this is supposed to be a black bag mission, this is supposed to be a black ops mission, and that people just simply can't go rogue. And so what he tells Quicksilver is to scout the area, to travel to New York City, and to try to find whatever he can to inform them of what it is that's taking place. We also see him calling on Storm to give them some mode of transportation, and to have Earthquake make sure that there's nothing that would attack them in the immediate vicinity, of course using her powers to create earthquakes to shell off any kind of foe that would attempt to attack them. We also see him calling on Red Hulk, on Thunderbolt Ross, and telling him that he's going to be the backup for Earthquake, so that if there are some measure of forces that are beginning to overwhelm her, that he can jump in and he can attempt to overthrow those forces as well. At this point, we transition back to Susan Storm and Wolverine, and of course again, they're in the past, in the 1960s I would go as far as to say, and what they're doing here is again investigating the area. But for Susan Storm, this is very weird for her. Of course, Wolverine comments and says that he thought the Fantastic Four had time traveled on multiple occasions, and Susan Storm says that's the case, but that she's never time traveled back into her own past and presumably landed on her own front door. This is something that she's not used to. And so what we see is that as soon as they land, that Wolverine has picked up the scent of Hank Pym, and the two of them begin to track this scent back to its origin. At this point, we realize that Hank Pym is experimenting on Dragon Man. And again, Dragon Man is a character that had been created or introduced in Marvel Comics as kind of what you saw back in that period of time, where you saw these sort of hokey or somewhat interesting kind of villains, as opposed to villains that were more down to earth, that were more basic and human in nature. And what he's doing is more or less just analyzing Dragon Man. He's really just looking at what it is that's taking place here, performing various experiments, trying to understand the technology that went into creating him. But as he's trying to figure this out, Wolverine arrives, and Wolverine says that Hank Pym is the reason for the end of the future. He's the reason why everything has gone south. And of course, Hank Pym is a little overwhelmed here. Hank Pym doesn't realize what's going on. He doesn't know what's taking place, and he asks Wolverine who he is. Wolverine introduces himself by saying that he's the ghost of Christmas future, that he is the one that's going to correct the mistakes that Hank Pym had made, but that he knows that Hank Pym, even if he's told don't create Ultron, is going to create Ultron anyway, not necessarily because he wasn't told to, but because he's curious to see what would happen if he did. And so Wolverine rationalizes that there is no way out of this situation for Hank Pym. There's no way for Hank Pym to survive this, and so he's decided that he is going to be the one that's going to kill Hank Pym. From this point, we travel back to the future, and what we see as Nick Fury's forces arrive is that the entire eastern seaboard has been converted into some form of machinery, that everything, that the entire area is for the most part devoid of life. Now, we don't know if the entire planet is devoid of any kind of human life, or if the entire planet houses some measure of human life, although they may be hiding out in various locations. But what Tony Stark comments here is that despite the fact that this is a very bleak outlook, despite the fact that this is a very dark future with regards to humanity, and the fact that all humanity may very well have been eradicated by Ultron, that the entire landscape here, the entire, series of machine structures here is something he finds to be very beautiful. But almost immediately after the superheroes arrive here, the invading forces of Ultron begin to attack them. And of course, Earthquake uses her powers to manipulate earthquakes to stave off a vast portion of these bots. And of course, Red Hulk himself is able to assist her as well. But then we see that in the background, more forces are arriving. And this is what happens with the superheroes. Nick Fury's team, as Wolverine had told us, had no real chance here. That Ultron knew they were coming, and that Ultron would have prepared defenses. But even then, the superheroes admit they weren't really prepared for this kind of a situation. They didn't believe that they would end up in a scenario whereby there was no human life whatsoever, and that the entire planet may most likely have been inhabited by the forces of Ultron. And so for the most part, the Ultron robots again continue their overwhelming barrage on the superheroes, and from this point we transition back to the past, and we see that Wolverine is attacking Hank Pym. He's attempting to kill Hank Pym, but as he's trying to kill him, he's explaining things to him, he's talking to him. He tells Hank Pym that of course he knows that he did good in the world, that he did some great things, but in this instance, the one act of creating Ultron outweighs any great thing he did, because creating Ultron led to such a bleak future. It led to such a terrible situation. But as he's preparing to deal the killing blow to Hank Pym, Susan Storm arrives. And Susan Storm says that they can't do this, that they can't kill Hank Pym, that killing Hank Pym could very well have consequences that none of them are prepared for. From this point, we switch back to the future again, and we see that all these superheroes on Nick Fury's team are being completely overwhelmed by Ultron's forces. We of course see that Storm is killed. We see that various superheroes are doing the best they can, but in the end, there's really nothing they can do due to the sheer number of Ultron robots. We also transition back to Susan Storm and Wolverine rationalizes that again, that Hank Pym, by virtue of his actions, killed everybody. And so again, Susan Storm says that there has to be some kind of a line here. There has to be some road that they don't cross, somewhere where they say that there's a difference between them and those that would go to the extremes to achieve their own goals. From here, we transition back to the future again, and this is what we see. We see this bouncing back and forth between the past and the future, and we see that Wolverine, as he's trying to kill Hank Pym, as he's making his argument to kill Hank Pym, that we're seeing various superheroes dying. For example, Captain America has had his head blown off. Nick Fury, of course, is being overwhelmed. And again, Wolverine is saying that everything that's turned out the way that it has done so because of the actions of Hank Pym. And this is when Susan Storm begins to acquiesce. She begins to give in, and she realizes that so many people, that billions of people are dead because of what Hank Pym had done, that billions of people are dead because of what it is that he had thought up. And so while Hank Pym is initially surprised to see that Susan Storm is giving in, that eventually he's killed by Wolverine. So as we continue our story on the Age of Ultron, I'm very excited to bring you guys issue number 7. And the reason why is because this is going to give us a really cool depiction of what the world is like without Hank Pym. Now, for the most part, we actually haven't really seen a world like this before. We've seen versions of it, we've seen variants of what it would be like without a character. For example, with Charles Xavier having been killed by Legion, we saw the Age of Apocalypse. And with the House of M, we saw the Scarlet Witch warping reality. But what we're going to see for the most part is a very dark and a very dystopian future, and it's really not like anything that we've seen to this point, because we're going to see some very interesting depictions of characters that we are quite familiar with. But as we continue with this story, we see that of course Susan Storm and Wolverine are headed back to Doctor Doom's time platform, and of course again they're going to be using this platform to travel from the past back to the present. And for the most part, Susan Storm is very curious about what's taken place. She's very unsure of things. For her, she feels as though they've crossed some line that they can't come back from. And Wolverine tells her that she was told to wait in the car, but the fact that she chose to appear when Wolverine was getting ready to kill Hank Pym, and the fact that she didn't stop Wolverine from killing Hank Pym means that as far as Wolverine is concerned, she's just as guilty as he is. At this point, we transition back to the present where Wolverine and Susan Storm have arrived, and what we see taking place is that the Savage Land is much different than they had previously seen, where in the normal timeline when Ultron had taken over the present, they had left the Savage Land, which had a litany of potholes and markers to indicate that a conflict had taken place there. We see that now the Savage Land appears to be some massive area housing a series of different kinds of ships. And again, Susan Storm and Wolverine aren't sure what to make of this. They really don't know what to do about this. And so Susan Storm makes both Wolverine and herself invisible, and they transition down, or I guess they move down to the ground level to investigate what's going on. What we also see is that there appear to be various individuals who are perhaps digging, or at the very least maybe trying to recover some various forms of relics. But we also see there are a couple of guards down here. Now the guards refer to themselves as Stark Guard Security, indicating that perhaps whatever it is that they're doing here is done at the behest of Tony Stark. But we also get a little bit of explanation here, at the very least, what passes for explanation in Susan Storm's hypothesis. And Susan Storm believes that because of the fact that they've discovered a skull belonging to one of the Skrulls, because of the fact that some of these ships are of Skrull origin and Kree origin, that perhaps the Kree-Skrull War did not go the way that it had in the normal Marvel timeline. And what I mean by this is, of course, the Kree and the Skrull had been warring for quite some time, and the planet Earth was a strategic location. It was really a major point within the conflict between the Kree and the Skrull. But during the normal timeline, the Avengers had helped to stave off the conflict from coming to the planet Earth, and this is one of the reasons why Wolverine is unaware of the Kree-Skrull War. But it appears as though in this timeline where Hank Pym doesn't exist, that the Kree-Skrull War was not stopped, or at the very least, it was not kept from coming to the planet Earth. And so from here we see that again, Susan Storm and Wolverine are not necessarily panicking here, but at the very least are trying to figure out what's going on. And so they take Nick Fury's, hover car, and they travel back to New York City. But once they arrive to New York, they see that the city isn't necessarily totally destroyed, but at the very least, it's a shadow of its former self in the sense that a lot of the buildings appear to have attained some kind of damage, or at the very least, they're simply beginning to rot away or beginning to fall apart into a state of decay. What they also see is a multitude of SHIELD helicarriers that are maybe observing the city, or at the very least probably trying to keep the city safe. Again, we don't really know here, but Susan Storm questions this. She asks the question, what is it that they've done? What is it that's happened here as a result of Hank Pym being killed off? But before they can investigate too much further, their hover car is shot down. At this point, we of course again see them trying to figure out what's going on, trying to understand what's taken place. And Wolverine, as he asks Susan Storm what it is that shot them down, or perhaps where it came from, Susan Storm replies by saying that she doesn't know, that she has no idea where the shot came from. But before again they can investigate too much further, a voice seems to chime in and ask them what it is that they think that they're doing here. At this point, it's revealed to us that the Avengers apparently don't exist anymore, and that in place of the Avengers, we now have the Defenders. And the Defenders, again, was a group that was largely formed under Doctor Strange in the normal Marvel Universe, but the group was not necessarily on the same level as the Avengers, but it seems that in this reality, that it is. What we also see is a change in lineup from the Defenders, where during the Infinity Gauntlet storyline, we saw the Defenders composed of Doctor Strange, the Incredible Hulk, Namor the Submariner, and others. Instead, we have what appears to be Captain America with an eye patch, as well as Peter Quill, Jan Van Dyne, who's wearing Miss Marvel's uniform, the Incredible Hulk, a one-eyed Cyclops, and the alternate reality version of Wolverine. Now, what we're going to be doing for the sake of this discussion is we're going to be referring to the alternate reality version of Wolverine as just that, as the alternate reality version of himself. But in order to differentiate between him and the other version of Wolverine, we're going to refer to the one from the normal timeline as normal Wolverine, just so that we can keep things easy to understand without things getting too convoluted. What we also see, and what's really interesting here, is that the Thing is part of the Defenders, but the Thing is very surprised to see Susan Storm because for some reason she may not exist in this timeline, or at the very least, may have simply just vanished. From here, because of the fact that they don't really know what's going on, that they assume that the normal version of Wolverine and Susan Storm are Skrulls, and so the intention of the Defenders is to capture them. Now initially, the idea of the Incredible Hulk is to pummel them, to absolutely smash them, but Doctor Strange tells the Incredible Hulk to hold on, and of course Captain America tells everybody to start talking. He tells the normal version of Wolverine and Susan Storm to explain. But again, for the most part, what's also, I guess, intriguing, and this is something that we haven't necessarily touched on, is that Jan Van Dyne chimes in and says that perhaps this is some sort of trick at the hands of Morgana Le Fay. Now, we haven't talked about Morgana Le Fay in Marvel Comics, and the reason why is because, for the most part, she's an adversary of Spider-Woman, Doctor Doom, and various other people, but she's not a very, very big character. She's not one that gets top billing. But because of the fact that she is a major player in this story, it really changes things. It has really Marvel more or less taken Morgana Le Fay and elevating her to a mainstream character. In addition, we see that, of course, the Thing says that he hasn't seen Susan Storm in years, and this is going to be a major part of Ben Grimm as he is trying to figure out what's going on and operating as part of the Defenders, in the sense that for whatever reason, for whatever it is that's happened here, Susan Storm again doesn't exist in this timeline. And so from here we see that Susan Storm, using her abilities, blasts the Defenders off guard. And when she does, in the time that they're occupied, she grabs Wolverine and makes the both of them invisible. Now from here, Wolverine, the normal version of Wolverine, and Susan Storm try to escape, but as the normal version of Wolverine explains it, this isn't going to do them any real good. And the reason why is because the alternate reality version of Wolverine is most likely like the normal version, and if that's the case, then when Wolverine picks up a scent, he never loses it. And so it's going to be highly unlikely that the normal version of Wolverine and Susan Storm are going to be able to successfully get away from the alternate reality version of Wolverine and the Defenders. And of course, this is what we see. We see that almost immediately after they get away, that they're pursued and tracked down by the Defenders. And what we see is this conflict taking place. We see this really interesting kind of situation where Susan Storm and the normal version of Wolverine are doing the best they can to hold off the Defenders, but in the end they're unsuccessful. They're not actually able to get away, and so for the most part they're taken away. They're held captive by the Defenders and taken back to presumably maybe one of the SHIELD helicarriers, or perhaps even the main SHIELD base. But what's also very interesting is we get some in-depth, maybe some insight into the Defenders, in the sense that they again don't really know what's going on here. Now initially the idea is they're saying they don't want to talk to him, whoever him is, but of course Doctor Strange says that most likely they're going to need to. They're going to have to talk to him. And what we learn is that the him they're referring to is actually Tony Stark, and that this version of Tony Stark differs vastly to the normal version of Tony Stark, in the sense that this one appears to be some amalgamation of cybernetics and normal humanoid appearances, indicating that perhaps he's a robot, or perhaps he's simply some kind of cyborg. So with Age of Ultron issue number 8, we get this really cool story where we learn what it was that had happened after the death of Hank Pym that had caused this reality to take place. Now for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with the idea of branch universe theory in Marvel Comics and in comic books as a whole, I would advise you guys to either go back and watch my video on how alternate realities function, or to go watch Benny's video on alternate realities and how they form within both DC and Marvel, because that's going to be pretty important for you guys to understand in order to really be able to get a good grasp on how this works. But what we see as we start this issue with is that Tony Stark has taken the memories of both Wolverine and Susan Storm and converted them into images, something that he can physically look at. Now we don't know, for example, how he's able to do this, but what we do know is that whatever technology is being used by him at this time is far more advanced than the technology that exists in the normal Earth 616 universe, indicating to us that perhaps something took place whereby technology had to be sped up. But what we see going on is that while Tony Stark is analyzing these memories, he's not necessarily analyzing them on his own. Of course, he's using Jarvis, but he's also made these memories in the form of images because he's enlisted the aid of Emma Frost and Professor Charles Xavier. And what this tells us is that both of these individuals exist within this alternate reality. Now, of course, Emma Frost and Charles Xavier were largely tied to the X-Men, but we don't know if the X-Men even exist at this point. Of course, we know that Cyclops, who is using the codename Cable, is part of the Defenders, which tells us that perhaps the X-Men maybe fell apart, they went away, or perhaps they were never even formed by Professor Charles Xavier and Emma Frost. All we know is that at this point, they've more or less just come together to work for Tony Stark. And what Tony Stark asks them is whether or not these memories could have been duplicated, whether or not they could have been falsely implanted, perhaps by Morgana Le Fay. Now, Morgana Le Fay, again, is a villain that we haven't got to yet in our discussions on this YouTube channel. But for those of you guys who are familiar with comic book villains, you know that Morgana Le Fay is not necessarily a major villain in the sense that she goes against a wide array of different teams, the X-Men, the Avengers, and so on. She's largely a villain of Doctor Doom, of the Defenders, and of Spider-Woman. But for this story, Marvel's elevated her to a major villain. But what we see Emma Frost and Charles Xavier saying is that even if Morgana Le Fay somehow had a hand in this, there's no possible way she could have implanted these memories into the minds of Susan Storm and Wolverine and allowed them to see two different things at the same time and interpret them different ways. That it's just not possible. And that if she does have that kind of magic, if she does have that kind of power at her disposal, then perhaps she's far more powerful than any of them had previously thought. But again, Tony Stark's a little reluctant here. Tony Stark's a little hesitant to believe that they come from an alternate reality. But if that's the case, if they do come from an alternate reality, if they do hail from a different dimension, and that Wolverine or Susan Storm or somebody had done something to alter the course of reality, then as far as Tony Stark is concerned, they've somehow managed to break time. And so again, the idea here is that the alternate version of Wolverine wants to interrogate the normal version of Wolverine. And Tony Stark says no. Tony Stark says this is not going to happen. Not only that, he also tells Xavier to send the Defenders away, which tells us that maybe there's trouble in paradise here, that things are not necessarily on a solid foundation between the Defenders and Tony Stark, that maybe there's an uneasy alliance here, that perhaps they were even coerced into undertaking this role. In addition, Emma Frost asked the question as to whether or not she should wipe the memories of this current event from the minds of the Defenders. And what Charles Xavier does here is he indicates to us that while this is an alternate reality, that his mindset and his belief systems still remain the same, in the fact that he tells Emma Frost that he doesn't like that kind of abuse of power. He doesn't like people using their powers to manipulate the minds of others or to use their powers on others against their will. And so what Tony Stark does is he tells Jarvis to pull up the security footage from Hank Pym's murder. From here, we switch to Wolverine, and Wolverine's being interrogated by Tony Stark. So presumably, this takes place perhaps some time after Tony Stark had looked at the footage. And what Tony Stark tells Wolverine is that for the longest time, they had believed that Hank Pym had been murdered by a Skrull. In addition, Wolverine asks Tony Stark what it is that happened to him, why it is that half his body is gone. And what Tony Stark says is that at some point in the past, after the death of Hank Pym, that the Avengers had split apart, that there was a war between Latveria, the home of Doctor Doom, and Asgard, the home of Thor. But that after this conflict, after this war had taken place, that Thor had vanished and that he hadn't been seen since. In addition, we learn that Morgana Le Fay has conquered half of the world and most of Europe, indicating that whatever kind of forces she has must be forces of incredible magnitude. What we also find out is that the Avengers had broken up after the death of Hank Pym, and that magic had somehow won over technology, and that Asgard, in addition to Thor, had turned their back on the planet Earth entirely. And so, as Tony Stark puts it, Wolverine had completely and totally broken the world by the actions, or by committing the action of killing Hank Pym. From here, we transition to Susan Storm, and Susan Storm is being held in some kind of giant square room, and she doesn't really know where she is. She's trying to call for someone to come in and talk to her, but nobody answers. And so what she does is she uses her powers to create force fields to somehow make a force field within the handcuffs that are used to bind her hands. And by using her force field, she's able to destroy these restraints and able to escape. At this point, we switch back to Wolverine, and Wolverine asks again what it is that's going on here, if he's under arrest, if he's allowed to go. But what Tony Stark asks Wolverine is if he knows what the butterfly effect is. Does he know what it means when one act takes place that influences a multitude of other acts? And what Wolverine says is that he doesn't think he did anything wrong here, that Hank Pym created a robot, and because he created Ultron, that the world had been left to burn. And so for him, he'd done the right thing here. But Tony Stark combats this by saying that it wasn't necessarily a robot, that it was artificial intelligence. It was a singular mind that was designed to capitalize on its own intelligence and to continually improve itself. And he asked Wolverine if he ever did anything to try to talk Hank Pym out of this, if he ever tried to get him to see the error of his ways. And Wolverine says that he tried, but inevitably he knew that it would have failed. And the reason why is because for people like Hank Pym and Tony Stark and Reed Richards, that is some kind of a religion, that once they realize they can do something, that they can somehow engage into a new foray of technology, that they have to do it, that they can't not do it. And so he felt as though, again, killing Hank Pym was his only option. And so Tony Stark looks at Wolverine and asks him if he believes he's some kind of a selfless hero, that he somehow saved the world. And of course, Wolverine says that he's not necessarily proud of it, but that he thinks he did the right thing. And Tony Stark says that if Wolverine believes that this current reality is better than the one that Wolverine came from, then Wolverine is a fool. And what this means for the most part, as far as our interpretation goes, is that even if Ultron had somehow managed to eradicate the past, even if somehow he'd managed to eliminate all these forces in the timeline that Wolverine had came from when they jumped into the past, that there was still the possibility that Ultron could have been stopped. There was still the possibility they could have done something to change things. But with this reality, it seems as though the world is on the brink of its self-destruction, and so there's really no way to get out of this circumstance. From here, we transition to one of the helicarriers, along with Colonel America, Jan Van Dyne, and others. And for the most part, again, the Defenders have band together because they want to know what it is that's taking place. They want to know what's going on here, indicating that, of course, the Defenders are being kept in the dark by the forces of Tony Stark and various other individuals, and they're not necessarily privy to the kind of information that would normally be done in the normal reality when we would see that the Avengers would share information with S.H.I.E.L.D. In addition, Emma Frost arrives here, and Emma Frost tells the Defenders that they've been ordered to go back to their R&R, to their rest and relaxation time, or to do whatever it is that they do when they haven't been called on for a mission. What we see is that, for the most part, I guess the thing, Ben Grimm wants to know what's going on with Susan Storm. He wants to know why it is that Susan Storm is here. He wants to know why it is that presumably she's alive, if it is the real her. And again, as far as Wolverine was able to detect using his senses, it was in fact the real Susan Storm, and so Ben Grimm is very confused here. In addition, the Defenders are very upset at the fact that for the most part they're being left in the dark, that they're being held out on information that they consider to be important. And so what Ben Grimm does is he initially goes and passes by Emma Frost and attempts to enter the helicarrier to find out what's taking place. But Emma Frost tries to grab him and stop him and tell him that if he keeps moving and doing what he's doing, that she's going to revert his mind back to a primitive state. From here, Doctor Strange, who appears to be the leader of the Defenders, steps in and says that if Emma Frost does anything like that he'll use his powers on her, that she's never to touch a member of the Defenders. And given the fact that she's displayed such an arrogance against one of his members, one of the members of the Defenders, he tells the Thing, Ben Grimm, that he's okay with his choice, and that Ben Grimm can now undergo the task of trying to find out what's going on with Susan Storm. At this point, we transition back to Iron Man and to Wolverine, and again, Tony Stark is continuing to interrogate Wolverine. And what he does here is he tells Wolverine there was another choice that could have been made here. There was a third decision. Wolverine had a multitude of opportunities in front of him, but he didn't think of the most rational one. He simply just thought of the only thing that he knew, which was to kill Hank Pym. What Tony Stark says is that Wolverine could have told Hank Pym about what was going to happen, and they could have devised a time-release virus. That this virus, at the right moment, could have been activated by Hank Pym and could have been used to kill Ultron. But instead, Wolverine decided to kill Hank Pym. What we also see is that while this interrogation interrogation is taking place, that the Thing Ben Grimm and the remainder of the Defenders are breaking into the helicarrier and trying to find Susan Storm. And so for the most part, we see these two situations going on at the same time. We see that Tony Stark is for the most part chastising Wolverine over the fact that he broke time. That time is not some kind of absolute construct, that it's not some kind of absolute thing. That time has ramifications, that manipulating time, that messing with time can cause a lot more problems than people had initially thought. And as we transition back to the Thing Ben Grimm, we see that of course they appear to be able to break into the holding cell containing Susan Storm. At this point, because the holding cell has been broken, I guess Jarvis comes in and tells Tony Stark that they're under lockdown. And Tony Stark begins to realize, or begins to believe, that maybe this is again some kind of trick by Morgana Le Fay. And Wolverine is surprised to see that Morgana Le Fay is even in the discussion here, that Morgana Le Fay is considered a threat by anybody. And as the door, I guess as the Defenders hover around the door and begin to break into it, when they get in, they realize that the room is empty. But Wolverine says that Susan Storm was just here, that her scent is very, very strong. At this point, the door slams shut behind them, and what we learn is that Susan Storm was in the room when they had first entered, but she had made herself invisible, and she had taken the opportunity, their surprise at believing she was gone, to sneak out and then shut the door behind her, effectively leaving Cyclops, the Thing, and Wolverine trapped inside of this room. From here, we again transition back to Tony Stark, and Tony Stark has left the interrogation room of Wolverine and is now pursuing Susan Storm. And again, while he doesn't necessarily believe this may be a attempt by Morgana Le Fay to infiltrate S.H.I.E.L.D. or to infiltrate what passes for S.H.I.E.L.D. and this alternate reality, he does believe that Susan Storm doesn't need to be there. And so the Defenders go to the aid of Susan Storm to a degree, but Tony Stark is also attempting to kill Susan Storm. But before anybody can really do anything in terms of their defense of either against or for Susan Storm, there's a massive flash of light in the sky. And as the light begins to dissipate, as things begin to come into clarity, we learn that out of this portal in the sky come the forces of Morgana Le Fay, along with an entire host of Doombots. At this point, the Defenders jump into action, and the Defenders do what they can to try to hold off the forces of Morgana Le Fay, but again, for the most part, they are absolutely helpless against such overwhelming odds. But again, we see that we transition back and forth between both the Thing, Ben Grimm, Cyclops, and Wolverine as they're trapped in the room, Tony Stark as he's trying to kill Susan Storm, as well as the Defenders who are fighting out in the open against the Doombots. And Tony Stark, once he arrives, demands that all of the drones at his disposal be used to combat the forces of Morgana Le Fay. And so for the most part, he's abandoned this attempt to kill Susan Storm and is trying to keep Morgana Le Fay from conquering this entire area. Again, we see that the Defenders are trying to do what they can to hold her off, but for the most part, they're unsuccessful here due to the fact that the Doombots that she has at her disposal are magically enchanted, given her ability to manipulate magic and sorcery, but also because there's just so many of them. And so as Tony Stark is battling Morgana Le Fay, he tells her that he thought it was a very interesting trick that she had attempted to have a clone or perhaps some kind of copy of Wolverine and Susan Storm enter the helicarrier and attempt to subvert them from within. But Morgana Le Fay says she doesn't know what he's talking about, that she has no idea what it is that he means when he says this, but tells him to turn around. And when Tony Stark turns around, he realizes that two of the helicarriers are crashing into one another and themselves crashing into New York City below. From here, we're going to bring this story to an end, and in the next issue, we'll see what happens with the fallout of this conflict when both of these helicarriers are crashing into the city, as well as what presumably happens between the normal and the alternate versions of Wolverine, and how everything appears to possibly go back to normal. So with Age of Ultron issue number 9, we're going to get this sort of piecing together of events, this idea of the alternate road that Wolverine could have taken had he actually decided to use the advice that was given to him by Tony Stark in the alternate reality. Now before we get too far into the story, I'm going to let you guys know ahead of time, this story is going to get confusing as fuck. So I'm going to do what I can to try to explain it as best I can to keep it as simple as possible. So what we see as we start this story is that for the most part, the helicarriers have already crashed into New York City. And New York City is almost totally destroyed. The immediate vicinity where the helicarriers have crashed is virtually in shambles. But in addition to this, almost all the superheroes, the Defenders, and most everybody who was part of this conflict is dead. But as we see, Wolverine is one of the only individuals who's able to escape, and he's able to get out of the rubble. From here, we switch to about 5 days later, and Wolverine's leg has completely healed itself. And as he prepares to walk away, to move away, he's attacked by a couple Doombots, indicating to us that over the course of this 5 days, that Morgana Le Fay has successfully been able to take over this half of the world. And so most likely she takes over the entire world. Now, we don't really know what happens with her after this. We don't know if she even survived the conflict or if she was killed in the process. But as things begin to move forward, we see that, of course, Wolverine is able to easily overpower and destroy these Doombots due to, of course, his adamantium claws, in addition to his accelerated healing factor. And so, for the most part, the Doombots aren't really able to do much against him. But after he's able to successfully destroy the Doombots, he again continues to walk away, but he's grabbed by Tony Stark. And Tony Stark asks him whether or not a person like Hank Pym could make so much of a difference, if his existence would really be able to change the world entirely, to make it something other than what it is right now. And so he tells Wolverine that he knows he's going to try to travel back in time and to stop himself from killing Hank Pym. He knows he's going to try to fix his mistake, but that he can't do that. And the reason why is because time, again, is not this indestructible thing. Time is not this absolute construct. Time, as he explains it, is a living organism that, while it doesn't necessarily have sentience, it doesn't really walk around and move around, that time is part of everything. It's part of all life, and that it can bend and it can break, and that if Wolverine keeps manipulating time too much, that he'll tear it and he'll destroy time entirely. And the question would become, what would happen if time didn't exist anymore? What would happen if it came to an end? Because the individuals who would be affected here would not just be Wolverine and Tony Stark and the other Earthbound heroes, that it would be the universe as a whole, indicating to us that it's quite possible that the ramifications of Wolverine's actions could have an impact on not just this universe, but other universes as well, which of course is something we will see in that Angela will be brought to this universe and that Galactus will be affected by Wolverine's actions as well. From here, we transition back to the point in which Wolverine had initially encountered Hank Pym and attempted to kill him. And for the sake of this discussion and what's going to be coming up, we're going to be referring to the Wolverine that's wearing gray as the normal Wolverine, and the Wolverine that's wearing his old uniform as the classic Wolverine. And again, I know this is a little confusing, but once the video begins to wrap up, it'll all make sense and it'll all tie together. But again, the normal version of Wolverine has not killed Hank Pym yet. And so of course, he's telling Hank Pym the same thing that he had told him, that he's transitioning back to the same moment when he says that Hank Pym had done some great things in the world, that Hank Pym had done what he could, but that in the end, the actions of Hank Pym wiping out, or I guess creating Ultron, who in turn wiped out all life on the planet, is something that just cannot be ignored. And so again, Wolverine prepares to kill Hank Pym. From here, we transition back to Susan Storm, who's standing out by the car, and Susan Storm is debating with herself. She's asking what it is that she's doing out here. Why is it that she's simply just waiting? She says that she can't let this happen, but that the needs of her friends are also the needs of her own. And so the question that she's debating with herself is the same debate that her and Wolverine had previously gotten into, where the issue was which one is more important, the needs of the many or what it is that she thinks is right. But before she's able to take any action, she's presumably knocked out by somebody. At this point, we transition back to the normal Wolverine as he's fighting and attempting to kill Hank Pym. But again, before he's able to engage too much further, before he's able to actually deal a killing blow to Hank Pym, somebody yells stop. And when they turn around, we see the Wolverine that had initially jumped forward and killed Hank Pym the first time. And again, we're going to refer to him as Classic Wolverine. And Classic Wolverine tells normal Wolverine that this isn't going to work, that Hank Pym dying is not going to fix the problem, that when Hank Pym dies, that it creates a reality that's just as bad, if not worse, than the reality that the normal Wolverine had left in an attempt to kill Hank Pym in order to fix it. And what a normal Wolverine believes is that perhaps this is some kind of a ruse, that perhaps this is some kind of a joke. But classic Wolverine tells a normal Wolverine to stand down. He says that this is not some kind of a ruse, that this is him coming to him to try to tell him what it is that's going to happen, what it is that's going to take place if he engages in this action. Classic Wolverine also tells Hank Pym that this is exactly what it looks like, that normal Wolverine had come there in an attempt to kill him, and that with his death, he had hoped that Ultron, by virtue of having never been created, would cease to exist and that the future would be fixed. But normal Wolverine asks classic Wolverine who it was that sent him, if it was Captain America, if perhaps he's there on Ultron's orders. But classic Wolverine tells normal Wolverine that it's the outfit that he's currently wearing is the only outfit that was brought with him, but that the whole purpose of him being here is to try to keep normal Wolverine from killing Hank Pym. And what classic Wolverine does is he gives normal Wolverine some kind of proof that he is really Wolverine. He simply just tells him 1928 Charlene Baumgartner. And this seems to be some kind of proof. This seems to be some kind of evidence to indicate that classic Wolverine is really Wolverine and that the two of them are existing in the same time. And so normal Wolverine begins to listen. He begins to pay attention to what it is that's going on, and he asks classic Wolverine what it is that they should do. And of course, he offers a few suggestions. He says maybe they should kill him another time. Maybe they should go back and kill him as a baby. But for the most part, classic Wolverine says no. He says that Hank Pym has to exist, that Hank Pym has to live, that he has to create Ultron. And he says that Tony Stark had given him some kind of an idea, something about possibly creating a virus. But for the most part, Hank Pym is very shocked to see all of this taking place. He's amazed to know that that Wolverine knows who Tony Stark is. He's amazed to know that he, of course, is an Avenger when he claims to have been an Avenger. It's really interesting for Hank Pym to watch this thing unfold, to learn that time travel does exist. And for the most part, we see that Hank Pym says okay. He says that if the future comes to a very dark point, if the future is led to a place whereby Ultron is able to conquer the world, then he simply won't make Ultron. But classic Wolverine says no. He says that everything that has ever happened up until the point when he first went back in time has to happen. That all those things have to take place. Otherwise, the universe could end up, or all of reality could end up in a much worse place than it is right now. And so again, the question is asked, does it mean that Ultron has to be created? And that if Ultron is going to mop the floor with them, then why should Hank Pym create Ultron in the first place? But again, classic Wolverine says that some kind of time-release virus can be installed in Ultron. Some kind of time-release virus can be made so that when Ultron attempts to take over the world the first time, that this virus can be activated and that Ultron won't actually come to power. But for the most part, we again see both of these Wolverines debating with one another. We see both of these Wolverines again trying to come to terms. Normal Wolverine still wants to kill Hank Pym, but classic Wolverine is continuing to try to convince him that killing Hank Pym will not fix the world's problems, that it will not make things better. Again, we see Hank Pym saying that he knows what he has to do, that for the most part, he's now prepared about what will take place. He knows that if Ultron being created is going to lead to Ultron evolving itself, and by virtue of evolving itself, leading multiple incursions against the Avengers and against the planet Earth, that now they'll know. But again, classic Wolverine says that this won't work, that Hank Pym has to continue, the timeline has to continue as if everything had simply just functioned the way it always did. And Hank Pym asks how. He says, how is he supposed to do this? How is this supposed to achieve? And at this point, Susan Storm chimes in, and Susan Storm says he's going to have to make himself forget. Now, this will be something that will actually happen outside of Hank Pym. It'll happen because of something he doesn't control. But for the most part, Hank Pym is again surprised to see Susan Storm, because in his time, in the 1960s, Susan Storm is much younger. But again, Susan Storm says that for the most part, they should bring Reed Richards in on this. They should get a hold of Reed Richards in their time, because what they can do is explain to that version of Reed Richards what it is that's taken place, and Reed Richards can help them come to terms with what's going on, help them figure out a way to solve things. But classic Wolverine says no. Classic Wolverine says that nobody else can know about this, because if anybody else is aware of this, then they'll in turn be affected by the actions here, and this has to be a self-contained situation in order to keep the timeline functioning the way that it always has. And so what Hank Pym does is he asks the question, how is this supposed to happen? He asks, how is it that he is supposed to create Ultron, knowing that Ultron is going to challenge and attempt to defeat the Avengers on multiple occasions, possibly leading to a situation whereby Ultron is going to take over the world? How can he do this without somehow doing anything to try to stop Ultron along the way, aside from creating a time-related virus, a time-released virus? But for the most part, we don't see any kind of answer that's given to him, because what we do is we transition back to Antarctica, back to the Savage Land, whereby we have the classic Wolverine, the one who initially traveled in time in the first place, the normal Wolverine, who was the version that classic Wolverine had encountered as he traveled back to try to stop himself from killing Hank Pym, and of course Susan Storm. And what Susan Storm asks is, are they both really going to come back here? Are they both really going to go back to the future? And what classic Wolverine says is no. He simply tells her to give them a minute. And so as the two of them enter the cave, classic Wolverine tells normal Wolverine that he's seen too many things, that he's seen what happens when Hank Pym dies, that he's seen all these future outcomes, he's seen what happens when Morgana Le Fay takes over the world, and that these are memories that he just can't live with, that he doesn't want to continue with. And so what he does is he tells normal Wolverine to kill him. And so from here we transition back to Susan Storm, and as a normal Wolverine, or I guess the only Wolverine now, is walking out, we get this kind of transition, we get this kind of situation where we see that of course Susan Storm is surprised to see that he killed the other version of himself, but we also see that Hank Pym is continuing to work on Ultron. And for the most part, Hank Pym is haunted by this. Hank Pym is really affected by the idea that he is consciously creating a robot that could potentially take over the world. And the question that Susan Storm asks is, what happens? What happens if Hank Pym creating a time-released virus is beyond his abilities? What happens if he creates a time-released virus in Ultron, but somewhere along the way Ultron becomes conscious of it and decides to correct it? No one really knows what would go on here. A lot of things are being left up to chance. But as the story begins to come to an end, as this comic begins to come to an end, we're left with Ultron as he's activating itself for the first time and calling Hank Pym his daddy. So with Age of Ultron issue number 10, we get the conclusion to this event, but what we also get is the results of what happened with Wolverine tampering with time, of what happened when Wolverine had effectively broken time. And as we start this story, we see that a package is delivered to Hank Pym around the time that Ultron attempts to take over the world, about some months before the forces of the Avengers successfully, or I guess encounter Ultron when he's reawakened. And for the most part, he doesn't know who deliver this package, although it's revealed to us to be Susan Storm. But when he opens it up, it's simply something, or a device of some kind that plays videos that simply says play me on it. And when he plays it, it's a video of himself from the past. And what he tells his future self is that there's a reason why he doesn't remember making this video, that he had been made to forget. Now we know that the reason why he had forgotten this, making this video, or the events around it, was because Ultron had modified his memories when Hank Pym first created Ultron. And of course this was something that was explained to us way back in the Avengers comics when the Vision had first appeared. Marvel had simply just used this as an explanation to why it is that Hank Pym doesn't remember making this video. But what his past self says is that of all the things that they had screwed up, of all the things, all the mistakes that they had ever made, that creating Ultron was the worst one. That because of this, Ultron is going to enact a set of actions, a set of circumstances that is going to lead to almost the end of the world as far as they know. And so what he says is that Hank Pym is going to have to do something that he's getting ready to tell him, that he's going to have to start a project that is going to effectively allow him to defeat Ultron. At this point, we jump back to the point in which Ultron first reawakens, when he first arrives. And of course the Avengers are doing what they can to combat Ultron, to try to bring an end to Ultron. But again, because of the power that Ultron possesses, because of the sheer strength that he has in his adamantium physique, or his adamantium body, he's able to easily take on the Avengers and able to easily overpower almost all of them. But in addition to this, Ultron realizes that something's going on here, that something's taking place. Now initially, the idea is that he thinks that perhaps it may be something tied into Tony Stark, but he also believes that Hank Pym has something to do with this. And as they're fighting, the questions being asked, is Hank Pym doing it? Is Hank Pym working on whatever it is he's working on? And Hank Pym says yes. Hank Pym says that he's still loading something. Now we're presuming that this is the virus that Hank Pym had created, although we don't know if that's an absolute fact. But again, Hank Pym says that Ultron is for the most part fighting this, that he's going to figure out what's going on, and when he does, he's going to shut it down. And so he says that the Avengers have to do something. They have to find some way to stall him. And so as the Avengers are fighting Ultron, Ultron is learning what's taking place. Of course, we see that Abigail Brand with Sword is calling in reinforcements, but for the most part, again, Ultron is figuring out what's taking place. He realizes that Hank Pym is involved in this somehow, that Hank Pym is doing something to alter his coding, to alter his programming, and Ultron deduces that what Hank Pym is trying to do is to shut him down, to deprogram him by reprogramming him. And this is what Ultron says. Ultron says that for the most part, this isn't going to work, that he is effectively closing every back door that Hank Pym opens, that he is correcting Hank Pym's code as it's being uploaded to Ultron. And so again, Ultron gets mad about this. Ultron feels insulted by the fact that Hank Pym would try something as basic as more or less creating a Trojan backdoor in Ultron's programming. And so what Ultron says here is that for the most part, he believes that it's time for humanity's existence to come to an end, that humanity doesn't serve a purpose, that the Avengers serve no purpose, and that he's going to effectively shut everybody down, he's going to kill them all, and he is presumably going to take over the world. But at this point, what we see is that whatever it is that Hank Pym had done appears to have been successful when Ultron begins to spaz a little bit, and then all of a sudden completely shuts down. And so what we get is this explanation from Hank Pym. Hank Pym says that what he had done, what he created in Ultron, was more or less of a ruse. It was a trick. He had effectively tried to create a backdoor in Ultron's programming, and Ultron, sensing this backdoor, attempted to shut it down. But when he did, it activated a subroutine that had already been created by Hank Pym when he first created Ultron. And when the subroutine was activated, it created a self-replicating virus that shut Ultron down. But by the time that Ultron had realized what this virus was, it was too late, and he was seconds away from shutting down entirely. And so for the most part, again, the question that's asked here by Iron Man, by Tony Stark, is how was it that Hank Pym knew this? How he knew that something like that needed to be done? How he knew that something like that needed to be done at this particular moment in time? But Hank Pym, for the most part, doesn't answer him. From here, we switch back to Susan Storm as she is traveling with Wolverine back to the Baxter building. And Wolverine tells her to enjoy her life, to enjoy spending time with her family, to make sure her family loves her. And as of course the two begin to part ways, there's some kind of a massive shake within the city of New York. And of course we see multiple variations of Wolverine. In fact, almost every major alternate reality of Wolverine appearing. Of course we see Old Man Logan among others. We also see the same thing with Iron Man. And for the most part, we don't really know what's taking place here. We don't know what's going on here. All we really know is that perhaps something's going on that's caused a backlash, maybe a kind of a blowback as a result of Wolverine manipulating reality. At this point, we jump to Beast, to Hank McCoy, along with Tony Stark and I believe Hank Pym. And the question that's being asked here is what's happened? What's going on? And so what Tony Stark more or less guesses is that time's been broken, that the space-time continuum's been broken by Wolverine. And for the most part, Hank Pym capitalizes on this. Hank Pym says that his guess is that because Wolverine had continually jumped back and forward in time, because he had repeatedly abused time, that he had more or less, torn the space-time continuum. And that again, no one really knows what's going to take place. No one knows what kind of other realities may be affected. And at this point, we switch to the Ultimate Universe with Miles Morales as Spider-Man. And as he's figuring out his powers, as he's learning and beginning to undertake the role of Spider-Man, again, there's some kind of massive flash in the sky. And when he looks up, he sees the silhouette of Galactus. But what we also see, and quite possibly more important than this, is the arrival of Angela into the Marvel Universe. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to an end. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, let me know. And let me know what you guys thought about this Age of Ultron series, if it was something that you guys really enjoyed, and if you did, we'll definitely try to do more like it. With that being said, I will catch you guys later. Peace.